The temperature had dropped to 53 degrees below zero, and Anders Johansson was pounding on Torsten Halvorsson's door, begging to be let inside. 3 days earlier, Anders had called Torsten a madman for building walls out of frozen water. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from, and if stories of forgotten frontier ingenuity move you, hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow's tale is even more unbelievable than this one. The pounding on the door came just after midnight on February 27, 1861. Torsten Halvorsson had been awake, tending the small fire in his stone hearth, when he heard the desperate hammering against the heavy wooden planks. He knew immediately what it meant. The catastrophic cold that had settled over the Dakota Territory 3 days earlier had finally broken someone. Through the narrow gun port he had built into the wall, Torsten could see Anders Johansson stumbling in the darkness, his breath crystallizing instantly in the air, forming clouds of ice that fell to the snow like powder. Anders was wrapped in every piece of clothing he owned, but it was not enough. Nothing was enough in cold like this. The man's movements were clumsy, the first sign of hypothermia setting in. He had perhaps 15 minutes before his body began shutting down. Torsten unbarred the door and pulled it open. The rush of outside air hit him like a physical blow, even though he stood in the doorway for less than 5 seconds. He grabbed Anders by the coat and hauled him inside, then threw his weight against the door to force it closed against the wind. The bar dropped back into place with a solid thunk. Anders collapsed onto the floor, shaking violently. His beard was encrusted with ice. His fingers were white, approaching the gray that meant frostbite had progressed beyond the superficial. Torsten pulled him closer to the fire and began stripping off the frozen outer layers of clothing. The fabric cracked as he peeled it away, stiff with ice from Anders's own breath and sweat. "I could not keep it warm," Anders gasped between chattering teeth. "The fire, I burned everything, but the cold came through the walls. Through every gap, I could not stop it." Torsten said nothing. He wrapped Anders in the thick fur blankets he kept near the hearth and held a tin cup of water, heated but not hot, to the man's lips. Anders drank in small sips, his body slowly beginning to respond to the warmth of the cabin, and the cabin was warm. Not comfortable by summer standards, but survivable. The interior temperature held steady at 11 degrees, 64 degrees warmer than the death that waited outside. The small fire in the hearth was enough to maintain this temperature because the walls did what walls were supposed to do. They kept the outside out and the inside in. Anders looked around the cabin as feeling returned to his extremities. His eyes moved across the walls, and Torsten saw the moment when understanding arrived. The walls that Anders had mocked, the walls he had called insane, the walls built from blocks of ice cut from the frozen lake and stacked like stone between a framework of logs. They were not just standing, they were working better than any cabin Anders had ever seen. "How?" Anders whispered, and the word carried the weight of a man confronting the fact that his certainty had nearly killed him. Torsten added another small piece of wood to the fire. "It is not the cold that kills," he said quietly. "It is the wind, the movement of air through gaps we cannot see. Ice has no gaps." Torsten Halvorsson had come to the Dakota Territory in the spring of 1853, part of the wave of Norwegian immigrants who saw opportunity in America's western wilderness. He was 22 years old, strong and capable with tools. His father had been a carpenter in Trondheim, and Torsten had learned the craft before the failed harvests of 1848 and 1849 convinced him that Norway offered no future. He sailed from Bergen with enough money for passage and little else. He did not go west immediately. For 2 years he worked in lumber camps in Wisconsin, learning English and saving every dollar he could. The work was brutal, but it taught him about American timber, about tools he had never seen in Norway, and about the vast forests that seemed to stretch forever across this new land. More importantly, it taught him about winter. Wisconsin winters were harsh, but the lumber camps had solid buildings, communal warmth, and experienced men who understood cold weather survival. In 1855, Torsten pushed farther west into Minnesota Territory, then across into what would become Dakota Territory. The fur trade was dying, but there was still money to be made, trapping beaver, mink, and marten along the tributary streams that fed into the Missouri River. He established a small camp near the confluence of two creeks in country that felt almost like home. Rolling hills, stands of pine and birch, cold, clear water. It was beautiful and isolated, exactly what he wanted. He met Astrid Larsdatter in the small trading settlement of Pembina in the autumn of 1856. She had come west with her family from Minnesota, part of a small group of Scandinavian settlers trying to establish farms in the Red River Valley. She was practical, strong-minded, and unimpressed by the rough trappers who frequented the trading post. Torsten noticed her because she was the only woman he had seen in 6 months who reminded him of home. She noticed him because he was clean, sober, and polite. They married in the spring of 1857. Astrid was 19. Her family was skeptical about her marrying a trapper, but Torsten promised he would build her a proper home and create a life that was more than seasonal wandering. He kept that promise. They built a cabin using the same methods every frontiersman used. Logs notched at the corners, gaps chinked with moss and mud, a single room with a fireplace, a loft for sleeping when winter cold made the main floor uninhabitable. It was not luxury, but it was solid. They survived their first winter together without serious hardship. Torsten ran his trap lines, and Astrid managed the cabin, tanned hides, and prepared food. They were competent, careful, and successful. By 1860, they had saved enough money to consider expanding their cabin, perhaps adding a second room. That was the winter Astrid died, and nothing Torsten had planned mattered anymore. February 1860 began cold, but not unusually so. Torsten had experienced colder winters in Wisconsin, and the previous February in Dakota Territory had been worse. He and Astrid had adequate firewood stacked against the cabin's north wall, enough salt, pork, and dried vegetables to last until spring, and plenty of furs and blankets for warmth. They were prepared, or so Torsten believed. The cold arrived on February 9th without warning. The temperature dropped from 15 degrees above zero at midday to 20 below by sunset. By midnight, it had fallen to 35 below. Torsten woke to the sound of timbers contracting in the walls, sharp cracks that sounded like rifle shots in the darkness. He added wood to the fire and checked the door, making sure the leather hinges had not frozen brittle. Astrid woke as well. She wrapped herself in a buffalo robe and sat near the hearth while Torsten rebuilt the fire. The interior of the cabin was cold enough that their breath formed visible clouds. Torsten estimated the temperature inside at perhaps 10 degrees, cold but manageable. The fire blazed up, and they sat together waiting for dawn. But the temperature did not rise with the sun. February 10th stayed locked at 40 below zero. The wind picked up, driving through every gap in the cabin's chinking. Torsten could feel air moving along the floor, cold currents that flowed despite the fire roaring in the hearth. He stuffed rags into the worst gaps, but there were too many. The moss and mud chinking that had seemed adequate in milder weather was failing under sustained extreme cold. It dried, cracked, and fell away in pieces. By the third day, Torsten was burning wood as fast as he could feed it into the fire. The heat went up the chimney or leaked through the walls. The cabin's interior temperature would not rise above 15 degrees, no matter how much fuel he used. Astrid stayed wrapped in every blanket they owned, but Torsten could see she was struggling. Her lips had a blue tinge. Her hands shook, even when buried in fur mittens. On the night of February 12th, the temperature outside dropped to 48 below zero. Inside, despite a fire that consumed wood at an unsustainable rate, the temperature fell to 5 degrees. Astrid went to sleep wrapped in buffalo robes, wearing every piece of clothing she owned. Torsten sat beside her, feeding the fire, fighting to keep the interior temperature above freezing. Sometime after midnight, Astrid stopped shivering. Torsten touched her face and knew immediately. Hypothermia had taken her while he sat 3 feet away, helpless despite his fire, his preparations, his careful planning. The cold had come through the walls he had built, and he could not stop it. Torsten buried Astrid on a hillside overlooking the creek on February 15, 1860. The ground was frozen solid, and it took him 6 hours to dig a grave deep enough. He worked in silence, methodically breaking through the iron-hard earth with a pickaxe, then scooping out the frozen chunks with a shovel. His hands blistered, then bled, then went numb. He did not stop until the hole was deep enough that animals would not disturb her. He wrapped her body in the buffalo robe she had died in and lowered her into the ground. There was no minister, no service, no words beyond what Torsten whispered in Norwegian as he filled the grave. When he finished, he stood in the bitter cold and looked at the mound of frozen earth. 3 years of marriage ended because a cabin could not keep out the cold. The simplicity of it made him angry in a way he had never experienced. Other trappers would have left. The territory held nothing but memories now, and spring would bring the seasonal migration to trading posts and civilization, but Torsten did not leave. He stayed in the cabin where Astrid had died, and he began to study it with the intensity of a man who needed to understand exactly how he had failed. He started with the chinking between the logs. In moderate weather, the mixture of moss and mud worked adequately. It filled the gaps, kept out wind and rain, and required only occasional maintenance. But under sustained extreme cold, it failed. The mud dried and became brittle. The moss compressed and pulled away from the logs. Gaps appeared that had not existed before, and those gaps allowed air to flow through the walls in continuous cold currents that no fire could overcome. Torsten experimented with different chinking materials. He tried clay mixed with straw. He tried pine pitch mixed with animal hair. He tried layers of birch bark wedged into the gaps. Each method was marginally better than traditional moss and mud, but none solved the fundamental problem. The gaps existed because logs were irregular. They tapered, they warped, they had knots and irregularities that prevented perfect contact. No amount of chinking could eliminate the spaces where air could move. He visited other trappers' cabins that spring, ostensibly for company but actually to study construction methods. He saw the same problems everywhere. Gaps in chinking, drafts along floors, interior temperatures that fluctuated wildly despite constant fires. Men accepted these problems as inevitable. Cabins were temporary structures, built quickly with available materials. They kept out rain and provided basic shelter. That was enough for men who spent most of their time outdoors. But it was not enough for Torsten. He had watched his wife freeze to death 3 feet from a roaring fire because the walls allowed cold air to flow through gaps. The failure was not in the fire or the blankets. The failure was in the walls themselves. Summer 1860 brought warmth to the Dakota Territory, and with it a clarity Torsten had not felt since Astrid's death. He continued trapping, but his mind was occupied with the problem of walls. He needed a material that eliminated gaps completely, something that could seal a cabin so thoroughly that air could not move through it. Every traditional material failed because organic materials compressed, dried, cracked, or deteriorated. In late June, Torsten traveled to the trading settlement at Pembina to sell his spring furs. The journey took 3 days by horseback, and he arrived to find the settlement busy with summer activity. Farmers were bringing in early crops, traders were organizing shipments downriver, and the small community was enjoying the brief warm season before another brutal winter arrived. What caught Torsten's attention was not the trading post, but the ice house behind it. The structure was simple, a square building half buried in the ground with thick log walls and a sod roof. During winter, workers cut blocks of ice from the frozen river and stacked them inside, packed in sawdust for insulation. The ice lasted well into summer, providing the trading post with the ability to preserve meat and keep certain goods cool. Torsten had seen ice houses before. They were common enough in settlements that needed to preserve food. But this summer, he looked at the structure differently. He watched as workers opened the door and pulled out blocks of ice in July, 5 months after those blocks had been cut from the river. The ice had barely melted. The building kept the cold in when everything outside was warm. The observation sparked something in Torsten's mind. Ice houses worked by preventing air movement. The thick walls, the packed sawdust, the buried construction, all of it eliminated the flow of warm air that would melt the ice. The building trapped cold the same way a winter cabin tried to trap heat. The principle was identical, just reversed. Torsten spent an hour examining the ice house, studying how the blocks were stacked, how the sawdust was packed between them, how the walls were constructed to prevent any airflow. The trader who owned the building thought Torsten was interested in building his own ice house and offered advice about construction techniques. Torsten listened carefully, asking questions about insulation, airflow, and the longevity of ice under different conditions. He left Pembina 2 days later with his payment for furs and a radical idea forming in his mind. Ice blocked air movement. Ice sealed gaps completely because it was solid, uniform, and could be shaped to fit precisely. Ice was strong enough to be structural, and ice was abundant every winter in the Dakota Territory. The counterintuitive realization hit him during the ride home. If ice could keep cold in during summer, preventing warm air from entering, could ice keep cold out during winter, preventing freezing air from entering? The physics were the same. Air movement was the problem. Ice eliminated air movement. Everyone knew ice was cold. Everyone associated ice with freezing and death. But ice itself was not the danger. Moving air was the danger. Air flowing through gaps carried cold into cabins and heat out of them. Stop the air movement, and you stop the heat loss. Ice could stop air movement better than any material Torsten had ever seen. The idea seemed insane. Build walls from ice to stay warm in winter. It violated every instinct, every piece of conventional wisdom about frontier survival. But Torsten had watched conventional wisdom fail. He had buried his wife because a traditionally built cabin could not protect her. Conventional wisdom was not good enough. Torsten waited until autumn to share his idea. He knew the concept would sound absurd, and he wanted to present it when winter was close enough that men were thinking about cold weather survival. In late September 1860, he rode to Anders Johansen's cabin, 10 miles south of his own location. Anders was a Norwegian immigrant, like Torsten, a competent trapper who had survived 5 winters in the territory. If anyone would listen to an unconventional idea, Torsten thought it might be Anders. He was wrong. Anders listened to Torsten's explanation for perhaps 3 minutes before interrupting. "You want to build walls from ice? From frozen water? To keep yourself warm?" The disbelief in his voice was absolute. "Torsten, I know you have suffered, and grief does strange things to a man's mind, but this is madness. Ice is cold, cold kills. You cannot build a cabin from the very thing you are trying to survive." Torsten tried to explain the principle of air movement, of how ice eliminated gaps, of how the ice house in Pembina kept cold in by stopping airflow. Anders shook his head throughout the explanation. "An ice house keeps ice frozen because the ice itself is cold. Your cabin needs to be warm. The moment you light a fire, your walls will melt. You will be sitting in a puddle of water, freezing to death in a collapsing cabin." The conversation ended with Anders suggesting Torsten spend the winter in the settlement, around other people who could help him recover from his grief. Torsten left without convincing him of anything. He tried again with Olaf Svensson, a Swedish trapper whose cabin was 8 miles east. Olaf's reaction was even worse. He laughed openly at the idea, then called over Erik Mortensen and Harold Anderson, 2 other trappers who were visiting. Torsten found himself explaining his concept to 4 skeptical men who grew more amused with each sentence. "Let me understand this correctly," Erik said, barely suppressing laughter. "You plan to cut blocks of ice from the lake, haul them to your cabin site, and stack them like stones to build walls. Then you will live inside this ice house through the winter, somehow staying warm despite being surrounded by frozen water." When Torsten confirmed this was exactly his plan, all 4 men burst into genuine laughter. Harold clapped him on the shoulder with rough sympathy. "Torsten, my friend, you are going to freeze yourself to death. That cabin will be colder than standing outside in a blizzard. Please, reconsider this foolishness." Torsten explained the physics again, the principle of eliminating air gaps, the way ice could seal a structure completely. The men listened with the patience people show to someone they believe is not thinking clearly. Olaf finally interrupted the explanation with a pragmatic question. "Even if your ice walls do not melt immediately, what happens in spring? Your entire cabin will collapse into a puddle." Torsten admitted he had not solved every problem, but insisted the concept was sound for winter survival. The men exchanged glances that communicated their shared opinion. Torsten had lost his wife, and now he was losing his mind. The kindest thing they could do was let him discover his mistake without getting hurt. Word spread through the scattered trapping community. Torsten Halvorsen was building a cabin from ice. The Norwegian who lost his wife had come up with a suicide plan for the winter. Men placed quiet bets on whether Torsten would abandon the idea before winter or die attempting to prove it worked. Torsten ignored the skepticism and began construction in early October 1860. He had spent the late summer carefully planning the structure, working out dimensions, and solving problems on paper before cutting a single log. The cabin would be small, 12 feet by 14 feet, just large enough for one man to live comfortably. The modest size was both practical and necessary. Smaller meant less ice to cut and haul, less surface area to seal, and easier temperature control. The foundation came first. Torsten dug a shallow trench around the cabin's perimeter and filled it with rocks gathered from the creek, creating a level base that would prevent settling. Most trappers skipped this step, but Torsten wanted stability. If ice blocks were going to be stacked like masonry, they needed a foundation that would not shift. The framework was the critical element that would make the entire structure possible. Torsten could not simply stack ice blocks freestanding. Ice was strong under compression, but would not hold together without support. He needed a skeleton of wood that would bear the roof weight and provide structure for the ice walls to fill. He cut and shaped logs for corner posts, each one sunk 2 feet into the ground and rising 8 feet above grade. These posts were thick, 10 inches in diameter, strong enough to support significant weight. Between the corner posts, he installed horizontal rails at the top and bottom, creating a rectangular frame. Additional vertical posts went in every 4 feet around the perimeter, forming sections that would be filled with ice blocks. The design was unlike any cabin framework his neighbors had seen. Traditional cabins used horizontal logs for walls, with the logs themselves providing structure. Torsten's framework was minimal, just enough wood to hold the shape and support the roof. The walls themselves would be ice, and the framework existed only to contain them. He built the roof structure next, before the walls went up. Heavy ridge beams spanned the width of the cabin, supported by the corner posts. Across these beams, he laid split planks, tight and overlapping. Over the planks went layers of birch bark, then a thick coating of clay mixed with sand, then sod. The roof was heavy, but the corner posts were strong enough to bear the weight. More importantly, the roof was complete before winter, which meant he could work on the walls and shelter if necessary. The door frame and window frame were built into the log framework, reinforced with extra bracing. Torsten made the door from thick planks, heavy and tight-fitting. The window was small, positioned high on the south wall, with a solid wooden shutter. Both openings were designed to be sealed completely when closed. By late November, the framework was complete. It looked strange, this skeleton of logs waiting to be filled. Neighbors who rode past shook their heads at the sight. Anders stopped by once, looked at the construction, and asked if Torsten had reconsidered. When Torsten said he had not, Anders sighed and rode away. Torsten stood in the center of his empty framework and looked at the spaces between the posts. Those spaces would be ice. Solid, seamless, impenetrable ice. If he was right, this cabin would be warmer than any structure in the territory. If he was wrong, he would die proving it. The framework stood complete by the first week of December 1860, and Torsten began the waiting period that would determine whether his theory could become reality. Ice required cold, sustained, and deep. The lakes and rivers of Dakota Territory froze every winter, but Torsten needed ice thick enough to cut into structural blocks. That meant waiting for temperatures to drop below zero and stay there for weeks. He spent the waiting time preparing tools and refining his plans. Ice cutting required specific equipment. Torsten had a crosscut saw, adequate for cutting logs but not ideal for ice. He modified it by filing the teeth to a different angle, creating a blade that would cut through frozen water more efficiently. He sharpened his axes until the edges could shave wood. He built a sturdy sled from young birch trees designed to haul heavy loads across snow and ice. The dimensions of the ice blocks mattered. Too large, and they would be impossible to move. Too small, and the construction would take forever. Torsten settled on blocks approximately 2 feet long, 1 foot wide, and 1 foot thick. At those dimensions, each block would weigh roughly 60 pounds, heavy but manageable for one man to lift in position. He calculated he would need approximately 300 blocks to fill the walls between his framework posts. December brought cold, but not the sustained freeze Torsten needed. Temperatures dropped into the teens at night, but rose above freezing during sunny afternoons. The lake near his camp developed a thin layer of ice that melted and refroze repeatedly. Torsten checked it daily, measuring depth with a wooden pole marked in inches. He needed at least 12 inches of solid ice, preferably more. His neighbors continued to monitor his progress with a mixture of concern and dark humor. Eric Mortensen stopped by in mid-December, ostensibly to check on Torsten but actually to see if he had abandoned the ice wall plan. When Eric saw the modified saws and the heavy sled, he realized Torsten remained committed to the idea. "You are serious about this," Eric said, looking at the tools. "You truly intend to build walls from frozen water." Torsten confirmed he was serious. Eric studied the cabin framework for a long moment, then shook his head slowly. "I have known stubborn men, Torsten, but you are beyond stubborn. This is obsession. When this fails, and it will fail, promise me you will move into the settlement for the rest of the winter. Do not die out here alone, trying to prove something that cannot work." Torsten made no such promise. Eric left shaking his head, convinced he was watching a man commit slow suicide. The deep cold finally arrived on December 20th. The temperature dropped to 15 below zero and stayed there. Over the next week, it fell further, reaching 30 below on Christmas Day. The lake ice thickened rapidly. By December 28th, Torsten measured 14 inches of solid, clear ice. It was time to begin. Torsten walked onto the frozen lake on the morning of December 29, 1860, carrying his modified saws, axes, and measuring tools. The ice beneath his feet was solid, thick enough to support a team of horses if necessary. The surface was smooth, covered with a light layer of snow that had fallen 2 days earlier. The temperature stood at 26 degrees below zero, cold enough that the ice would not soften during the day's work. He began by clearing snow from a large rectangular area, sweeping it aside with a wide board until bare ice showed beneath. Then he started marking cutting lines. Using a straight edge and a metal scribe, he scored the ice surface in a grid pattern, each rectangle measuring 2 feet by 1 foot. The lines needed to be precise. Poorly cut blocks would not stack properly. The actual cutting was brutal work. Torsten started with his crosscut saw, cutting vertical lines through the ice. The modified teeth bit effectively, but ice was dense and the saw wanted to bind in the cut. He worked steadily, pulling the saw through each cut with measured strokes, letting the tool do the work rather than forcing it. Each vertical cut took approximately 10 minutes of sustained effort. Once he had vertical cuts defining the front and back of a row of blocks, he used a long ice saw to cut horizontal lines underneath, separating the blocks from the main ice sheet. This was the most difficult part. He had to lie on the ice, reaching down into the water that immediately began seeping up through the cuts, working the saw blade horizontally to free each block. His hands went numb within minutes, despite heavy mittens. When a block finally separated, Torsten used iron tongs to grip it and haul it up through the hole. 60 pounds of ice, dripping and slick, had to be wrestled onto the sled. The first block took him nearly an hour from initial cut to loading. By the third block, he had refined his technique and cut the time to 30 minutes. It was still exhausting work. He cut and loaded 6 blocks that first day before the failing light forced him to stop. His hands were blistered beneath the mittens, his back ached from bending and lifting, and his clothes were soaked with ice water that had frozen into a stiff shell. He hauled the 6 blocks to his cabin site, unloaded them carefully beside the framework, and returned to his temporary shelter completely spent. The next day, he cut 8 blocks, the day after, 10. He established a rhythm, working from first light until darkness, cutting and hauling in a steady pattern that consumed every ounce of strength he possessed. The lake ice was abundant, but transforming it into building blocks was perhaps the hardest physical labor Torsten had ever experienced. By January 5th, he had cut and hauled 160 blocks. They were stacked beside his cabin framework, a growing pile of frozen water waiting to become walls. Torsten began building the ice walls on January 7, 1861. The temperature had dropped to 32 degrees below zero, perfect conditions for working with ice. At this temperature, the blocks would not soften or become slippery, and water used to seal joints would freeze within minutes. He started with the north wall, the side that would face the worst winter winds. The first course of blocks went directly onto the stone foundation. Torsten positioned each block carefully, checking with a level to ensure it sat perfectly horizontal. The blocks did not fit together like precisely cut stone. Ice cut from a lake had minor irregularities, small variations in thickness and shape. Torsten compensated by chipping away high spots with a hatchet and filling low spots with packed snow that quickly froze solid. Between each block, he poured water into the joint. The water froze almost immediately in the extreme cold, creating a bond stronger than mortar. Within minutes of setting a block, it was locked in place by ice fused to its neighbors. The effect was exactly what Torsten had envisioned. The wall became a single solid piece, not individual blocks, but a continuous barrier of ice. The vertical framework posts stood every 4 feet, and Torsten built the ice walls between them. The posts provided stability and bore the roof weight, but the ice provided the barrier against wind and cold. As each course of blocks went up, Torsten checked alignment constantly. A wall that leaned or bulged would fail under the roof's weight. The work was slow and demanding. Each block had to be lifted into position, checked for level, adjusted if necessary, and sealed with water. Torsten's hands were constantly wet from handling the water bucket, and despite heavy gloves, his fingers cramped from the cold. He worked in short bursts, warming his hands over a small fire every 30 minutes to prevent frostbite. The north wall reached full height after 4 days of work. 7 courses of blocks, stacked tight and sealed solid, created a barrier 7 feet tall and 1 foot thick. Torsten stood back and examined his work. The wall was translucent, allowing diffused light to pass through but not clear enough to see through. It was smooth on both sides, with only minor irregularities where joints between blocks showed. He moved to the east wall, then the south wall with its window opening, then the west wall with its door frame. The process was identical for each section. Cut blocks to fit around openings, stack them level and true, seal joints with water that froze instantly. The work consumed all of January. Some days, extreme cold or high winds forced him to stop early. Other days, he managed to complete an entire wall section. By January 28th, all 4 walls were complete. The cabin stood enclosed, its framework filled with solid ice. Torsten installed the heavy door and fitted the window shutter. He sealed the gaps around both with additional ice, chipping it to fit the irregular spaces. When he finished, the structure was airtight. With the ice walls complete, Torsten turned his attention to the details that would determine whether the cabin was merely unusual or actually functional. The door presented the first challenge. He had built it from thick planks during the autumn, but now it needed to seal against ice walls rather than log walls. The contact points between wood and ice required careful fitting. Torsten used his draw knife to shape the door edges, creating surfaces that matched the ice wall perfectly. Where gaps remained, he packed them with wet cloth that froze solid within minutes, creating a seal as tight as the ice blocks themselves. The door hung on heavy iron hinges he had purchased in Pembina the previous summer, hinges strong enough to support the door's considerable weight. A thick wooden bar on the interior provided security. The window shutter received similar attention. Torsten had positioned the window opening deliberately high on the south wall, where it would catch maximum sunlight during short winter days. The shutter was built from double layers of planks with birch bark sandwiched between them for insulation. When closed and barred, it sealed the opening completely. When opened during daylight hours, it allowed dim light to filter through the translucent ice walls, supplementing the small amount that came directly through the window. Inside the cabin, Torsten built a raised sleeping platform along one wall, keeping himself off the frozen ground. He constructed it from split logs, tight-fitted and level, positioned near where the fireplace would be. The platform stood 2 feet high, providing storage space beneath and placing him in the warmer air that would rise from the fire. The fireplace was his final major task. Most trappers used simple fire pits or crude mud fireplaces, but Torsten needed efficient heat. He built a small stone fireplace in the corner using rocks gathered from the creek and mortared with clay. The firebox was compact, designed to burn wood efficiently rather than wastefully. The chimney was narrow, just wide enough to draw properly, constructed from stones to a height of 2 feet above the roofline. He tested the chimney draw before completing the interior work. A small fire of kindling produced smoke that rose cleanly up the flue without backing into the cabin. The narrow chimney created good draft while minimizing heat loss. Satisfied, Torsten built the fire larger and observed how the cabin responded. The interior temperature began rising immediately. More importantly, it rose steadily without the fluctuations typical of drafty cabins. The ice walls were doing exactly what Torsten had theorized. They blocked air movement completely. No cold drafts crept along the floor. No warm air escaped through gaps. The cabin was sealed as tight as a glass bottle. After 2 hours of burning a modest fire, the interior temperature reached 45 degrees. Outside, the temperature stood at 18 below zero, a 63-degree differential achieved with less firewood than a traditional cabin would consume in 30 minutes. Torsten sat on his sleeping platform and allowed himself the first moment of satisfaction since Astrid's death. Torsten moved into his ice-walled cabin on February 1, 1861, carrying the few possessions he had kept in his temporary shelter. The transition was anticlimactic, just a practical shift from one structure to another, but the difference in living conditions became apparent immediately. The cabin maintained a stable interior temperature with minimal effort. A small fire in the morning and another in the evening kept the space comfortable enough for work and sleep. The first week was a learning period. Torsten discovered that the ice walls had thermal properties he had not fully anticipated. They were not just barriers against wind. They acted as thermal mass, absorbing heat when the interior was warm and releasing it slowly when the fire burned low. The temperature inside the cabin fluctuated far less than in any structure Torsten had previously inhabited. He also learned the ice walls created an unusual acoustic environment. Sound was muffled, absorbed by the ice in a way that made the cabin remarkably quiet. Wind that howled outside was barely audible inside. The silence was profound, almost unsettling at first, but Torsten came to appreciate it. The cabin felt removed from the harsh world outside, a protected space where the rules of winter survival were different. Maintenance was minimal. Unlike traditional cabins where chinking constantly needed repair, the ice walls required nothing. They were solid, unchanging, and impervious to the temperature fluctuations that caused traditional building materials to expand and contract. Torsten checked the door and window seals occasionally, but they remained tight. He resumed his trap lines in mid-February, working the territory he had trapped for years. The routine was familiar and grounding. Each evening, he returned to his cabin, built a small fire, prepared food, and sat in the warmth while the Dakota winter raged outside. The interior temperature typically held between 35 and 50 degrees depending on fire activity, while exterior temperatures ranged from 0 to 30 below. His neighbors noticed the smoke from his chimney, evidence that Torsten had survived the first month in his ice cabin. Anders rode by in late January but did not stop, apparently unwilling to admit curiosity about whether the insane plan was actually working. Eric stopped briefly in early February, ostensibly checking trap lines but clearly interested in whether Torsten was still alive. "You are still here," Eric observed, looking at the ice walls with obvious skepticism. "The cabin has not melted." Torsten invited him inside. Eric dismounted and entered cautiously, as if expecting to find a frozen death trap. Instead, he found a comfortably warm space, noticeably warmer than his own cabin, with far less smoke from the chimney. Eric stood in the center of the room, clearly struggling to reconcile what he was experiencing with what he had predicted. "It is warmer in here than in my cabin," Eric finally admitted. "How much wood are you burning?" Torsten showed him the modest woodpile outside. Eric's eyes widened when he realized Torsten was using perhaps a third of the wood. Eric burned daily in his traditional cabin. The third week of February brought unusual weather signs that old-timers recognized as warnings. Torsten noticed them first on February 18th, when the normal winter wind died completely. The air became still, so quiet that sound carried for miles across the frozen landscape. The sky took on a pale, washed-out quality, neither fully overcast nor clear. Animals behaved strangely. Ravens that normally scavenged near cabins disappeared. Deer moved to low ground near creeks. Torsten had experienced enough Dakota winters to know these signs meant a major storm was approaching. But the specific character of the warning signs suggested something beyond a typical blizzard. The absolute stillness, the strange sky, the animal behavior all pointed to catastrophic cold, the kind that arrived perhaps once or twice a decade and killed anyone unprepared. On February 19th, he rode to Anders's cabin to share the warning. Anders was outside splitting wood when Torsten arrived. They talked about the weather signs, and Anders agreed something significant was coming. But Anders had survived 9 winters in the territory. His cabin was stocked with firewood, food, and furs. He expressed concern but not alarm. "Whatever comes, we have weathered worse," Anders said, gesturing at his woodpile. "I have enough fuel to keep a fire burning for a month. My cabin is tight. I will be fine." Torsten did not argue, but he noticed the gaps in Anders's chinking, the drafts that were visible as wisps of smoke leaking from the cabin. Anders's confidence was based on surviving previous winters, but Torsten suspected what was coming would be different. He stopped at Olaf's cabin on the way back to his own territory. Olaf was less dismissive of the warnings. He had lived in northern Sweden before immigrating and knew about cold that could kill in minutes. But Olaf also believed his cabin was adequate. He had survived 5 winters in it without serious problems. "I appreciate the warning, Torsten," Olaf said, "but I think we will be fine. These February storms are harsh, but they pass quickly. 2 or 3 days of hard cold, then it breaks." That evening, the temperature began dropping. It fell from 20 below to 30 below by midnight. By dawn on February 20th, it had reached 38 below zero. The stillness remained absolute. No wind, no clouds, just clear skies and cold that intensified hour by hour. Torsten prepared his cabin carefully. He brought extra firewood inside, stacking it where it would stay dry and accessible. He filled containers with water while he could still break through the ice on the creek. He checked the door and window seals one final time, then he built up his fire and waited. The temperature continued falling throughout February 20th. By evening, it had dropped to 45 below zero. The next morning, February 21st, Torsten measured 50 below using a spirit thermometer. Inside his ice-walled cabin, the the temperature held at 22 degrees with a small fire burning. February 22, 1861, began at 51 degrees below zero. By noon, the temperature had fallen to 53 below. The cold was absolute, a physical presence that seemed to drain life from everything it touched. Trees cracked with sounds like rifle shots as sap froze and expanded inside them. The air itself seemed brittle, crystallizing breath instantly into clouds of ice particles that fell to the ground like powdered glass. Torsten kept his fire burning steadily but not large. Inside his ice-walled cabin, the temperature held at 11 degrees. It was cold enough that he wore heavy clothing and stayed wrapped in furs, but it was survivable. He could move, think, and function. The cabin was doing exactly what he had designed it to do. The ice walls blocked all air movement. Not a whisper of wind penetrated. The small fire's heat stayed inside instead of bleeding through gaps and cracks. 4 miles south, Anders Johansson was burning wood as fast as he could feed it into his fireplace. His cabin's interior temperature had dropped to -5 degrees despite a fire large enough to be dangerous. The flames roared, consuming his carefully hoarded woodpile at an alarming rate, but the heat vanished almost as quickly as it was produced. Cold air poured through gaps in the chinking, flowing along the floor in rivers of freezing wind. Warm air escaped through cracks near the ceiling. The cabin had become a conduit for cold rather than a barrier against it. Anders wore every piece of clothing he owned. He wrapped himself in buffalo robes and huddled as close to the fire as he dared. But he could feel the cold winning. His hands were numb. His feet had lost feeling an hour earlier. Ice was forming on the interior walls where his breath condensed and froze. The fire demanded constant attention, constant fuel, and it was still not enough. 10 miles east, Olaf Svensson faced the same desperate situation. His cabin, built using the same traditional methods as Anders's, was failing in identical ways. Olaf had already burned through half his winter woodpile in 2 days. The interior temperature refused to rise above zero, no matter how much wood he fed the flames. His young son, barely 8 years old, was showing signs of hypothermia despite being wrapped in every blanket they owned. Eric Mortensen and Harold Anderson were fighting the same losing battle in their respective cabins. Each man had believed his structure was adequate. Each had survived previous winters without serious problems. But this cold was different. It found every weakness, exploited every gap, and overwhelmed every defense that traditional construction provided. By the evening of February 22nd, the temperature had dropped to 55 below zero. Inside Torsten's ice-walled cabin, he maintained 20 degrees with a fire that consumed perhaps 6 pieces of wood over the entire day. He prepared food, tended his fire, and survived in relative comfort. He thought about his neighbors and wondered if they were realizing that conventional wisdom was killing them. The pounding on Torsten's door came at midnight on February 27th. 5 days into the catastrophic cold snap, and someone was outside in temperatures that could kill an exposed man in less than 15 minutes. Torsten grabbed his rifle instinctively, then recognized the desperate, irregular rhythm of the knocking. This was not a threat. This was someone dying. He looked through the gun port and saw Anders Johansson collapsed against the door, barely able to stand. Anders's face was ghost-white, his beard encrusted with ice from his own frozen breath. He was not wearing adequate clothing for the journey between cabins. He had clearly left his own shelter in desperation, without proper preparation, gambling everything on reaching Torsten's door before the cold killed him. Torsten unbarred the door and pulled it open. The rush of outside air was like being struck. Even that brief 5-second exposure made his eyes water and his lungs burn. He grabbed Anders by the coat and dragged him inside, then threw his weight against the door to force it closed. The bar dropped back into place, sealing them in warmth again. Anders collapsed on the floor, his body racked with violent shivering. Torsten stripped away the frozen outer layers of clothing and wrapped Anders in furs. He held warm water to Anders's lips, forcing him to sip slowly. The color began returning to Anders's face, but his fingers were dangerously white, edging toward the gray that meant serious frostbite. "My cabin," Anders whispered through chattering teeth. "I could not keep it warm. The fire, I burned everything, but the cold came through everywhere, through the walls, the floor, the ceiling. I could not stop it. I thought I would die tonight." Torsten said nothing. He focused on warming Anders gradually, knowing that rapid temperature change could be as dangerous as the cold itself. He added a piece of wood to his small fire and adjusted Anders's position to maximize warmth without allowing him too close to the flames. Anders looked around the cabin as sensation returned to his body. His eyes took in the ice walls, the modest fire, the comfortable interior temperature. Torsten saw the moment of understanding arrive, the same realization Erik had experienced, but magnified by desperation and near death. Anders had mocked these walls. He had called Torsten insane, and those walls had just saved his life. "How warm is it in here?" Anders asked quietly. 11 degrees, Torsten replied. "Outside is 53 below." Anders did the mathematics in his head. 64 degrees of difference. His own cabin, with a fire 10 times larger than Torsten's, had maintained perhaps 40 degrees of difference at best, and even that had not been enough. The mockery he had offered now felt like poison in his memory. Before Anders could speak again, there was another knock at the door. Weaker this time, barely audible. Torsten looked through the gun port and saw Erik Mortensen standing in the deadly cold, swaying on his feet. Torsten opened the door again and pulled another dying man inside. By dawn on February 27th, Torsten's small cabin sheltered 3 men instead of 1. Erik had arrived barely conscious. His core temperature dropped to dangerous levels. Torsten had spent the night managing 2 cases of severe hypothermia, gradually warming both men while preventing the shock that rapid temperature change could cause. Now, with morning light filtering through the translucent ice walls, both Anders and Erik were conscious, stable, and confronting the reality of what had happened. The interior temperature of the cabin held steady at 14 degrees. Torsten had increased the fire slightly to accommodate 2 additional bodies, but even with 3 men breathing and generating heat, the fuel consumption remained modest. Outside, the temperature had dropped further overnight, reaching 57 below zero. The differential was now 71 degrees, maintained by walls built from frozen water. Anders sat wrapped in furs, flexing his fingers cautiously. 2 fingers on his left hand had progressed to 2nd-degree frostbite, the tissue white and hard. They would likely survive, but he would carry scars. His feet were better, having avoided serious damage because he had worn heavy boots for the desperate journey to Torsten's cabin. He looked at the ice walls with an expression that mixed awe with shame. "I called you a madman," Anders said quietly. "I laughed at this idea. I told others you were going to freeze yourself to death building a cabin from ice. And last night, this cabin saved my life, while my own cabin, built the way every trapper builds, was killing me." Erik nodded from his position near the fire. His condition was worse than Anders's. He had stayed in his failing cabin longer, burning through his entire woodpile before admitting defeat. The journey to Torsten's cabin had been even more desperate than Anders's. Erik's face showed frostbite damage on both cheeks and his nose. His hands were badly affected, several fingers showing the gray discoloration that meant tissue death. He would lose parts of at least 2 fingers, possibly more. "I do not understand how this works," Erik said, looking at the walls. "Ice is cold. We know ice is cold. How does building walls from ice make a cabin warm?" Torsten explained again, but this time his audience listened with desperate attention rather than dismissive skepticism. He described air movement, convective heat loss, and the difference between material temperature and insulation effectiveness. He explained how traditional cabins failed, not because logs were poor insulators, but because gaps between logs allowed air to flow continuously, carrying heat away faster than any fire could replace it. "The ice eliminates gaps completely," Torsten said. "It seals the cabin perfectly. Air cannot move through ice. Wind cannot penetrate it. All the heat from the fire stays inside instead of escaping through cracks. The ice itself is cold, yes, but it is not moving. Still, cold is manageable. Moving cold is what kills. Anders asked about melting, the question everyone had raised. Torsten pointed to the interior surface of the ice walls. They were solid, unchanged since construction. At temperatures below freezing inside the cabin, the ice had no reason to melt. The catastrophic cold lasted 8 days total, finally breaking on March 1, 1861. The temperature rose rapidly from 55 below to 20 below in less than 12 hours, a shift that brought relief and new dangers. Men who had survived the extreme cold now faced the challenges of frozen water supplies, depleted food stocks, and frostbite injuries that required treatment. Torsten, Anders, and Erik emerged from the ice-walled cabin to survey the damage across the scattered trapping community. What they found was sobering. Harold Anderson had survived in his cabin but suffered severe frostbite on both feet. He would lose several toes and possibly part of one foot. His winter's worth of furs and supplies had been burned in a desperate attempt to maintain heat. He was alive but financially ruined. Olaf Svensson's situation was far worse. His cabin had failed completely on the 3rd day of extreme cold. Olaf had made the decision to attempt reaching the settlement at Pembina, 30 miles south. He had bundled his 8-year-old son in every warm item they owned and started the journey on horseback. They had made it 17 miles before the cold overwhelmed them. A passing group of hunters found them 2 days later. Olaf had survived with catastrophic frostbite. His son had not. The news of the boy's death spread through the community like a shockwave. Every trapper understood the risks of frontier life, but a child's death from cold, while his father fought desperately to save him, struck a different chord. Men who had mocked Torsten's ice walls now asked quiet questions about how they were built. Anders became Torsten's most vocal advocate. He showed his frostbitten fingers to anyone who asked about the cold snap and told the story of how Torsten's ice-walled cabin had maintained survivable temperature while traditional cabins failed. Erik, once he recovered enough to travel, visited other trappers and shared the same message. The impossible had happened. A cabin built from frozen water had proven warmer than cabins built from wood. In mid-March, a group of 5 trappers arrived at Torsten's cabin asking for instruction. They wanted to understand the technique, to learn how ice walls were constructed. Torsten walked them through the entire process, from framework construction to ice harvesting to wall building. He shared measurements, methods, and the reasoning behind each decision. The men listened with the intensity of people who had faced death and wanted to ensure it never happened again. By April, 3 new ice-walled cabins were under construction in the territory. The builders knew they had missed the window for completing them before spring thaw, but they worked anyway, learning the technique for application the following winter. Torsten helped where he could, offering advice and checking construction quality. The mockery he had endured was forgotten, replaced by a desperate desire to replicate his success. Olaf Svensson visited Torsten in late April, gaunt and broken from grief and injury. He had lost 4 toes and part of his left foot to frostbite. He had buried his son on a hillside near Pembina. Spring 1861 brought thaw to the Dakota Territory, and with it came the question Torsten's neighbors had raised from the beginning. What happens to ice walls when temperatures rise above freezing? The answer arrived gradually as March turned to April and the brutal winter finally released its grip on the land. Torsten's cabin began melting in early April. The south-facing wall, which received direct sunlight for hours each day, showed the first signs of deterioration. Ice blocks that had been solid and structural throughout the winter began weeping water that ran down to the foundation. Within 2 weeks, the walls had thinned noticeably. By late April, they were collapsing, leaving only the wooden framework standing with pools of water around the base. Torsten had anticipated this outcome. The ice walls were never meant to be permanent. They were a winter survival structure, purpose-built for the season when cold was the primary threat. As spring arrived and temperatures moderated, the cabin's usefulness ended. He salvaged the wooden framework, the door, the window shutter, and the materials that would survive. The ice returned to water and soaked into the ground. But the technique itself did not melt away with the ice. Word of Torsten's innovation spread throughout the Northern Territories during the spring and summer of 1861. Trappers, hunters, and early settlers in Montana, northern Dakota, and the contested regions near the Canadian border heard about the Norwegian who had built a cabin from frozen water and survived cold that killed others. Some dismissed it as exaggerated frontier tale. Others recognized it as a genuine solution to a deadly problem. By the autumn of 1861, at least 15 ice-walled cabins were under construction across the northern frontier. Builders modified Torsten's basic design to suit local conditions and available materials. Some used stone frameworks instead of wood. Others experimented with double walls of ice separated by air gaps. A few tried mixing sawdust with water before freezing, creating a composite material that was easier to cut and slightly more insulating. The specific implementations varied, but the core principle remained constant. Ice eliminated air movement, and eliminating air movement was the key to surviving extreme cold. The winter of 1861 to 1862 was milder than the previous year, but several ice-walled cabins proved their worth during cold snaps that reached 30 and 40 below zero. Men who had built using Torsten's technique reported the same results he had achieved: dramatic temperature differentials, minimal fuel consumption, and survival in conditions that would have been life-threatening in traditional structures. Torsten himself built a second ice-walled cabin in the autumn of 1861, refining his methods based on a full winter's experience. He made the framework stronger, positioned the cabin to maximize southern sun exposure, and improved the door sealing technique. The second cabin performed even better than the first, maintaining interior temperatures above 20 degrees during the coldest nights while consuming remarkably little firewood. Over the following decade, the technique became established knowledge in the extreme northern frontier. It was never universal. Most trappers and settlers continued building traditional log cabins, accepting the limitations as part of frontier life.